me. So welcome. Um, Welcome to the session. And thank you very much, Howard, for agreeing to meet us today in this conversation about the long-term futures of humanity. Before we move into exploring the long-term futures, I wanted to actually maybe ask you to share some highlights of your life story, because I see you as a very special kind of person who literally followed the birth and expansion of the internet throughout its stages of development. And you are considered part of this elite group that some identify as the cyber world government, the Gigirati group. I don't know how serious is that, but anyway, that's part of your identity as people talk about. And you're also known to be one of the first online moderators ever in the world. So you have seen how this thing was developing. So probably you have more rights than anyone to talk about the future of this digital reality unfolding in front of our eyes. So maybe we could start by quickly yourself introducing what are some highlights you consider in your life that people should know about.
Okay, I'm 74, so I may have to talk fast to get a lot in. When I was 16, I had a vision of the future through psychedelics, in which I realized that the generations that are alive on Earth now, that was in the 20th century, are going to be facing a crisis for our species, and that the drama of the human race is going to depend on what we do. This was before really the climate crisis or AI became well known, but I remained very interested in both consciousness and technology, because I thought those were the important driving forces in the world. I became involved with digital media as a practitioner, as someone looking for better tools, which put me in sympathy with many of the people who created personal computers and the internet, because that was also their motivation. I was trying to make a living as a writer, and my writing tool was a typewriter, and my research tools were a telephone and a library card. And I remember there were some people saying that computers could help us do this. I'll skip a lot of the story. I talked myself into a job at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. We're really the first computers that you could call personal computers, using what we now know as the graphic user interface, were being used, and they used the mouse, which had been invented some years before by Doug Engelbart. And when I was there, was about the time that personal computer revolution was happening, and a lot of people were paying attention to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And from my work at Park, I understood that, first of all, these are not just better writing machines. These are mind amplifiers that can extend our ability to think and communicate. And the other thing that I realized was that you could actually see where this was going. There were stories that weren't popular, but I think were very important about how the technology was built by people building on the work of many others. And I wrote a book called Tools for Thought in 1985. And that rather established a pattern of writing and talking about what would happen about 10 years in the future. So in 1985, I was talking about what might happen when personal computers became much more powerful and many more people would have them. as part of the process of writing that book, I connected my computer to my telephone with a now obsolete device known as a modem, and I connected with people who were having conversations online. Really the forerunners of what we now call social media. I became involved in the Well, which had been founded by the people who made the Whole Earth catalog to bring this kind of new kind of computer communication to all kinds of people. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that. I first wrote my first article on virtual communities in 1987. Took me until 1992 to get a book contract because publishers kept telling me that only electrical engineers would want to use computers to communicate with. And that's really been a pattern, and a pattern that has faced the people who created these technologies. A lot of people spend their lives looking in the rearview mirror as they're going into the future. And so I wrote a book, The Virtual Community, in 1992 when the internet was first getting going. I became the editor of the Whole Earth Review, and in 1994, the Millennium Whole Earth catalog. I was involved in starting the first commercial webzine for Wired magazine. And then I had a startup called Electric Minds that was named one of the 10 best websites in 1996 and was out of business in 1997. I really learned a lot about what the entrepreneurship and innovation and capitalist mix is. And I became aware that
you could also be claimed to be one of the early startuppers in the Silicon Valley, at least of the recent wave, the internet wave.
Well, I always considered myself to be a participant observer, having started out as a writer, and I just became involved in the story I was covering. And then again, about 10 years ago, the 1999, 2000, I became interested in the coming intersection of mobile telephones and the internet, and people organizing collective action in new ways. I wrote a book called Smart Mobs. It was published in 2002, a good 10 years before the Arab Spring and other manifestations. And then in the 2000s, the questions about whether all of these technologies are good for us or bad for us as individuals, as families, as communities, and societies, I decided that the answer had to do with what people know, that it's really not about the technology or even the infrastructure and the economics. It's about who knows how to use these technologies, that there was an emerging gap, not between the haves and the have-nots, because most people on Earth now have access to a supercomputer in their pocket. But between those who know how and those who don't know how. So I wrote a book that was published again about 10 years ago in 1992 called Net Smart, about what I felt were the social media literacies. I mean, sorry, it was 2012. And I started teaching those literacies in 2005. I taught at UC Berkeley, and at Stanford, I taught courses on social media issues, social media literacies, and digital journalism. And so I retired from teaching in 2015. I spent some years writing and interviewing about pedagogy, and that's actually how I met Pavel, through our mutual interest in the future of education. And I'm still interested in that, but now I'm more or less a full-time artist. So I'm learning, I've always painted, but now I'm learning woodworking and electronics and a little bit of programming to do what I want to do with the arts. So that's the quick wrap up.
Yeah, what a life. And Howard, begin our journey, because I wanted to first ask you your experience of first encounters with the collaborative nature of internet, and then maybe to quickly cover the last, let's say, 30-40 years that you see unfolding. First of all, you mentioned this community that was promoting the whole Earth catalog. I think most people in Russia don't know about it. It's a very interesting, let's say, tool for ecological movements and awakening of ecological consciousness that was popular throughout 70s, published by Stuart Brand and his team. And but yes, you were co-creator of this community, whole Earth learning. What was online library?
Electronic link.
All right, electronic link. So, as a moderator of that community, again, it's like literally one of the first ones in the world, and so you were like basically opening up a new continent. What was it like to you, and what did you learn about collaboration and the potential of internet to enhance it?
Well, I would have to say that some of the things that still interest me today were immediately available to me. As a writer, I was somewhat isolated at home. Here I could connect with other people, and I think that this is one of the driving characteristics of the internet to this day, for good and for bad, is that you can connect with people who share a particular interest, whether you had known of those people or not, or whether they even lived in your part of the world. So now, with, I don't know, more than 2 billion people on the internet, if, for example, you have a disease that only 1 million people have, 1 in a million people have, there are 2,000 others out there. So for a lot of people who had been isolated, this was a lifeline. And of course, if you're a terrorist, the same thing is true as well. And that's something I would like to emphasize, is that when you amplify the ability of humans to think and communicate, you're going to amplify their ability to do things that are going to be healthy and beneficial, and you're going to amplify the ability of people to do destructive things as well. But I found on the well that there were engineers and school teachers and artists and policemen, and that this was a way for different kinds of people to communicate with each other informally. And as we got to know each other, we became what I learned much more recently to call a personal learning network. I knew what interested people, and if I came across some information that might interest a particular person, I would share it. And so I much later learned what a lot of these things are called. There's something that social scientists call diffuse reciprocity. Reciprocity means you do something for me and I do something for you. But what if you do something for someone that you don't expect to return that favor, but they belong to the same group that you do, and you know that if you ask for a favor, someone else in that group who you may not know will do something for you. So I think that's very much true. And one thing that I learned when I started teaching college students was that there was a sociologist, very well known in sociology circles, by the name of Mancur Olson, who wrote a book called The Logic of Collective Action. And in this book, he pretty much proved, and it became established doctrine, that people are not going to create public goods. A public good meaning keeping the sidewalks clean, for example, if they are not incentivized by money, or if they are not related to each other, or if they're not a small group. But of course, the internet came along. The web itself is an example of a public good that was created by people long before money was and incentive. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about different methods of collaboration, but I think what we're seeing is that the logic of collective action was wrong, that people will get together with others, even people they don't know, and will share and will collectively create things that everybody can use if the right conditions are met.
Mhm. Excellent. So looking at, I know this is going to be a difficult question because you lived through all those stages, but looking at the last decades of internet evolution, you mentioned there were both positive and negative shifts, and that part of the story is who knows how to use these tools for thought, tools for collaboration. What do you see as shifts that positively impacted our collective potential for collaboration, for collective learning, and those that were, let's say, negatively impacting? And what are some which we can call powerful forms of collaboration that emerged? Probably Wikipedia, but maybe it's some others that inspire you.
Well, I think collaboration was built into the architecture of the internet with the technical decision that you didn't have to get permission to start something new. You could plug your computer into the internet and you could get people to use your search engine. You didn't have to rewire anything as long as you talked the language of the protocol. So the ability to innovate was radically democratized by the architecture of the internet. And then when the web came along, the link, the hyperlink, was the single collaborative tool that enabled millions of people to build the web as we know it. I think a lot of people don't understand that it was not built by a government or a company, although certainly the US government and the Defense Department were involved in creating the internet. The web was created by millions of people who made web pages and linked to each other. And we did it for a variety of reasons. From that basic platform, a number of ways for people to do things together that they weren't able to do before emerged. Again, it may surprise people that when the web first started, it was not a social medium. It was a publishing medium. You put up pictures of your pets on it, or you linked to scientific papers. I coined the term the social web in 1996 when I had that startup. Technically, we were just beginning to use forums for people to have like threaded conversations online. And people had slow modems, but we knew that broadband was coming. That right in the early days, you communicated through words that you typed on a screen, but we knew that video and audio and other things would be coming along. What are the different kinds of collaborative activities that I wrote about in NetSmart? Because I think these are all skills that if people can learn them, can enrich themselves and their communities. There's collective intelligence, virtual communities, social production. By social production, I mean the web itself, open source software, Wikipedia, many people working together collaboratively without financial incentive, creating knowledge and useful software, crowdsourcing, peer learning, and collective action. Again, collective action can be spontaneous global response to a disaster, which we've seen time and again all over the world, or it can be coordinated terrorism. Again, if you're going to amplify the abilities of humans, you're going to amplify what humans are. If you're going to ask, is the world online good or bad? Essentially, what you should ask are humans good or bad? So I'll surface a thread that I think you can see behind all this, which is, I think that the critical uncertainty is education, that our technologies have made possible social practices that have changed the world very rapidly. And the social technical changes have outstripped the ability of education systems to equip people to deal with it. You know, but not too many years ago, you could get a book from a library and pretty much trust what was in the book. There was an author and an editor and a publisher, the person who ordered it for the library, the librarian, the teacher who may have assigned it. Now, you can ask any question, anytime, anywhere, and get 10 million answers in less than a second, but it's up to you, the seeker of that information, to determine whether it's real or unreal, whether it's true or false, whether it's deliberately false. I'm generally hopeful. One of the things I'm less hopeful about is this.
Quite an interesting question, this epidemic of fake news and intentional disinformation, which we anticipated to start happening in late 2010s, as we were forecasting the future, and started to happen. We see it as a tool for political combat, but once it starts to spread beyond political, let's say, debates into other spheres, we see now the reaction to pandemics, how fake news start to spread across networks to prevent people from, for example, vaccination or any other reasonable solutions to pandemics. So what do you think we can do about it? And is there a pathway? Because the Enlightenment age is evidently over, and the monopoly for truth from science is not there anymore.
Well, again, I think you can teach people some basics about being able to determine which information may be helpful and which information may not be. We're not teaching it in the schools. I think it ought to be taught when children are 11 or 12 years old. They're already using their phones to search the web. What's concerning is that there's kind of an arms race between the ability to determine the truth of information online and the ability to deceive. We're seeing computational propaganda that is using artificial intelligence to micro-target influential information to people who may not know that that's happening. We saw experiments at Facebook did experiments where they manipulated the information that people saw and could measure changing their moods. They could make them happier or less happy. So we're seeing powerful methods for influencing people without their knowledge, and we're seeing very, very little educational response to it. Again, you know, in the United States, there was a debate 100 years ago. There was a journalist by the name of Walter Lippmann who said the United States has become too technically sophisticated and too complicated for the American people, who are too ignorant and too easily influenced. He was debated by John Dewey, who said, well, if the American people are ignorant, maybe we need better journalism. And if they're too easily influenced, maybe we need better education. So here we are 100 years later, and it's
exactly
the same
the
debate.
point where this is very, very relevant.
And you know, there's a problem around the world, which is critical thinking requires teaching your children and your students to question the reality that others are presenting to them. I'm not saying that they should reject it. I'm saying that they should question it. And any teacher or any parent will tell you that it's not easy to put up with your children or your students questioning why you are telling them things. Education institutions in every culture in the world are the most conservative. Conservative in the sense that they really teach the values of the previous generation. That schooling as we know it was really a way to educate agricultural workers so that they could work in factories in the 20th century. And that's no longer the world we're living in.
Well, all of this sort of bridges us to the next question I wanted to ask. So you are the pioneer of these new forms of connected and collaborative online learning, and I hope some people managed to see the video you shared. If not, they will do it after our talk. But we still see that, right, with all these tools, the intention of large systems, including governments and many technological companies, and I can think of Chinese companies or even the model of largest leading US universities, all of them are creating what we can call broadcast platforms, the ones that try to shape and steer learners instead of empowering them, instead of offering them peer-based learning. And like long-term, probably the chance that peer-to-peer learning, connected learning will win over is likely, but it's not guaranteed. Do we see tendencies towards it, or do we see tendencies against it? And what is your bet on the future here?
Well, when I started teaching at Stanford, it concerned me that so few other teachers were using what was not yet called social media, forums and wikis and chat, along with their face-to-face teaching. So I asked an expert there in the education department, and he said, well, that's an easy question. This is a knowledge factory, and professors are hired here because of their contributions to their field. There's not really any incentive for innovating in pedagogy. So it's not in the big knowledge factories that you're going to see the innovation. I decided that instead of trying to change the institutions, I would try to find the innovators and connect them with each other. It's a lot about what connected learning is about. And there are many educators, as you know, all over the world who are innovating in many senses in ways that their administration doesn't even know about. They're flying under the radar. I did over 100 interviews that are on my website with innovators in digital media and learning. You know, the way paradigms shift usually is when the old people retire and the young teachers take over, then the new ways of teaching and learning will take over. But we don't have time for that. We really need to speed up education and learning. Another critical uncertainty is the degree to which a literacy of peer learning using the collaborative tools that are available online will spread. And I think it's not out of the question that people will teach each other how to use these tools to learn. You see that in things like Minecraft and in the gaming community, where young people are teaching each other. And, you know, until very recently, unless you were one of the very few people who could teach themselves, schools had a monopoly on learning. Now you've got the lectures of the best professors in the world. You've got all of the texts you could possibly want. You've got video, and you've got means of communicating, annotating, sharing knowledge, organizing knowledge. How you use all these tools to organize, self-organized learning was the project I started 10 years ago, the Pedagogy project, to create a manual for that kind of learning. so that people could get a group together, and if they wanted to learn something, they would have some means of determining what are the best sources, how do we organize those resources, what media do we use, how do we assess what we're learning. I think those are literacies of learning that could spread. If that sounds a little crazy, look at how the web spread. I was not a programmer, and I'd say that most of the people who put up websites were not programmers, but there was something called view source, where you could look at somebody's website and you could look at the source code of the website and copy it and change a few things and use it on your own. So I see, and Wikipedia, who would have thought that people would have created a free encyclopedia in so many languages that continues to grow every day. So I think,
and constantly improved in, and all the tools that you were talking about, the skill of critical thinking, the open debate about validation of to make statements truly like politically neutral, religiously neutral, and so on. It's all part of the culture of Wikipedians. And that's probably one of the largest community that teaches this in practice.
Well, I think one of the things that makes Wikipedia work is its social innovation they call neutral point of view. If you have a point of view on a subject and you write that, well, another editor who disagrees with you is going to edit it, and there are going to be edit wars. So you need to write so that the people who disagree with you aren't going to change what you're writing, what they call neutral point of view. So again, I think this is an example of where a simple social norm can enable people using a new technology to do things that they weren't able to do before. It always takes the technology, the way of using it, and the way of teaching it, going all the way back to Doug Engelbart in 1962, who really created so much of the digital media we know of today. And if you haven't seen his Mother of All Demos, go to YouTube and search for Mother of All Demos, and you'll see what I mean. He originally wrote about humans using language, artifacts, methodology, and training. And we've seen the artifacts, the computers and the networks, are literally billions of times more powerful than they were when he wrote that. But what we know about the language we use, the methodology and the training really has not improved that much. So I think we have the advantage of knowing what needs to be improved. How is that going to happen with the incentives that are in the system today? That's the critical uncertainty.
And that also, so to say, bridges us very nicely to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the general situation. Like let's go look beyond education, and let's look into what is happening in general with, let's say, these tools for thought, tools that are supposed to amplify our collaboration and our collective potential. And you have just indicated that so many innovations have already happened. But I see some very strong tendencies. One is let's say there is this algorithmic creation of manipulation tools, shaping our communication spaces. These algorithms in social media put us into sort of communication bubbles where we sort of isolate in these what we can call echo chambers, where we only hear our peers and no one else. We don't really get other points of view other than the ones we like. Then that leads to a larger societal isolation, and many of these groups self-isolate in different forms of ignorance and hatred. And this recent movie, okay, that may also be a little bit propagandistic, The Social Dilemma, but it highlights some of these challenges, and also the fact that it is done in the interest of technological, financial, and political elites currently. But long term, there's a loss, a massive loss of the, let's say, the all these connections that create our society, the larger collaboration. And again, the other thing is that can this lead to some kind of civilizational blind alleys where, for example, if we are getting increasingly steered by these algorithms and rankings and whatnot, would that destroy diversity? Would that create some kind of dystopian futures where everyone only is interested in this ranking and not really self-develop, self-recognize, move into more creative spaces, exploratory spaces, and so on? So I think right now we're at some kind of crossroads, some kind of turning point where the possibilities of dystopian futures and very optimistic futures are both possible. So what are your, let's say, maybe recommendations or maybe visions for the possibility of more optimistic futures? And what kind of scenario would be desirable for you? Is it a deep democracy or something else? How do you see it?
Well, you know, there are even larger forces that are facing us right now. And again, I go back to Doug Engelbart. He really started thinking about making tools for thinking in the 1950s. He was a veteran of World War II, and he saw that after the nuclear weapons and the computer, that humans were creating problems for ourselves at an increasing rate. And he wanted to help create tools that would enable people to collaborate to solve those problems. Well, now the world is just going through a pandemic. And if you talk to virologists, they will tell you that this is not going to be the last one or the most dangerous one. We are seeing, well, I think you're seeing the same thing in Russia that we're seeing in the US today. Siberia is experiencing temperatures that you expect in the Sahara. The Pacific Northwest of the US is experiencing temperatures that have never been recorded before. We're seeing huge wildfire danger. So the climate change scenario, which I think all of us through wishful thinking have been projecting into the future, is coming at us very, very quickly. I'm also concerned about ethical artificial intelligence. That algorithmic manipulation that you're talking about is really in the pre-AI stage. Autonomous weapons. There is some evidence that autonomous weapons were used in Libya. That is a weapon that uses artificial intelligence to decide who to kill. We have some really serious problems facing us that on a global level that are going to require global cooperation, both in terms of the collaborative tools we have available and, you know, people trying to cooperate to face these challenges. And, you know, the pandemic would not have been dealt with. The vaccines would not have been created if it had not been for the digital networks and the way that scientists have used them to collaborate. So again, the things that are causing problems are also potential solutions to the problems. And some people call it solutionism. Some of the solutions that have been created are creating problems. When you talk about the algorithms that are capturing and driving people's attention, you're really talking about corporate capitalism. That's why the algorithms are driving your attention. They want your attention so they can show you ads. It's unpredicted, perhaps, that the same technology that's used to micro-target ads is also used to micro-target propaganda. I'll have to say that this was not totally unpredicted. In 1968, G. Debord wrote The Society of the Spectacle, in which we're living now. And probably even further out than him was in the 1980s, Jean Baudrillard wrote about hyperreality, that not only are we increasingly living in a mediated simulation, but the knowledge that we're living in a mediated situation is being hidden from us. Well,
what's your bet?
The answer is
what to do about it. The problems are there.
European regulation of Facebook and Google is beginning to show that you can do some things about it. I don't see, it has to be some form of political regulation. There has to be some kind of international agreement. And I worry because the people who make regulations, both nationally and internationally, are not always the most well-informed about the technology. Certainly the people who make laws in the US are not very technologically well informed. We used to have something called the Office of Technology Assessments that had a nonpartisan advice to Congress about what technologies mean. Again, it's kind of an education crisis. If the world leaders knew what they had to lose by not acting on the climate crisis more swiftly, they might act more swiftly. When I wrote Smart Mobs, it seemed to me that the main point of the technology was that it was enabling people to engage and organize collective action in ways that they weren't able to do before. In researching that, I found that there were people in many different fields. Elinor Ostrom in economics, and William Hamilton in game theory, biologists, computer scientists, who were all studying different aspects of human cooperation. But there really wasn't a unified effort. And if you think about the problems and the trends that you and I have been talking about, if we better understood how and why people cooperate, what the barriers to their cooperation are, we might be able to design better systems. I don't think it guarantees it, but I think that, well, a good analogy to use is that there was a time when people thought that diseases and plagues were caused by foreigners or sin or witchcraft. And then the microscope and Louis Pasteur, looking through the microscope, discovered that there were invisible to the naked eye little microorganisms in the water. And if you boiled your water, you wouldn't die. I think in terms of understanding human cooperation, we're kind of at the understanding that the microorganisms stage. I'm happy to say that I gave a TED talk in 2005 that I believe is translated into Russian. So if you go to the TED site, you can find it.
We'll make sure to put a link into our systems.
So that was 15 years ago, calling for an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary study of cooperation. And I'm happy to say that it seems to be happening. I know of efforts at University of Amsterdam and Arizona State University. And there's a anthropologist at Harvard by the name of Joe Henrich, who wrote a book called The Secret of Our Success that it's probably translated into Russian. And we don't really have time to get into the details of this, but the research on how it is that humans are different from all other species has to do with our ability to organize social learning. There are other species that do a little social learning, but we're the only ones who teach. So again, you see, it comes back to education, and the whole point about culture being defined as everything that you're not born with, that you have to learn to do, that someone has to teach you. In biological evolution, there has to be a mutation that has some kind of favorable outcome, and it takes millions of years for that to spread. So by cultural evolution, if one person discovers how to capture fire and keep it going, then everyone in the tribe can look at that and learn how to do it themselves. And not only that, but that they will teach the next generation. Someone else discovers that if you put some meat in the fire, you can digest it better. Suddenly the whole tribe knows that. So cultural evolution through learning goes much faster than biological evolution.
Excellent. So let's say we are at this point in 2021. We look ahead into the challenges such as quantum computing, general artificial intelligence, all kind of autonomous warfare, manipulative governments and corporations that use algorithms to really get into our brains. How can we co-evolve with all of this, and how can we amplify our potential for collective learning to kind of counteract against these powerful trends?
Well, of course, the people with power and wealth have always been able to control the destinies of other people. But now we're seeing, through the ability of anybody to communicate with anybody else, that things can begin to move. I would use the example of Greta Thunberg, who was just a teenage girl sitting on a street in Stockholm, starting a worldwide movement. In the last week, the Sunrise Movement, young people inspired by her blocked all the entrances to the White House because they wanted them to talk about addressing the climate crisis. You know what? It's up to the young people. They're the ones who are going to have to try to survive in this world that they didn't create and that is causing a problem for them. And they're becoming aware of it, and they have tools. Again, will they be able to educate each other? Will they be able to use their collective action to influence public policy? That, I think, is when I started writing about the future of using computers to communicate, I thought, well, what is the most important possible outcome? And I decided it has to do with, are individuals going to be more free in their lives, or are they going to be more controlled by governments? Will there be more democracy, more rights, or will it be less? And that led me to the theory of the public sphere that was Habermas in Germany wrote about, the fact that democracies are not just about voting for your leaders. It's about having a population who are educated enough and free enough to communicate that they can discuss and argue about issues, and from that form public opinion, and with public opinion influence policy. In the US, the civil rights movement, worldwide, the women's movement, these are all forms of people using their communications to change the public sphere. Right now, the public sphere is not very healthy online. It's a great way of infecting people with bad ideas. The bad ideas and the bad information spreads much more quickly than the good information. I don't know the solution. I think it has to be some kind of combination of social and technical. For an example of that, I happen to know a number of people who are knowledgeable about climate issues. So I can make a list of the people that they think are knowledgeable, and I can check with that list about things that I have questions about. And same things are true if you have a disease. You can find people who know what they're talking about. you can build a personal learning network. I think if we taught more people how to do that, their use of social media would be much more effective for them personally and for everyone else. So I think the question, I don't have the answer, but the question is, how do we make a healthier public sphere where people can have good information, have reasonably rational arguments about it, and use their discourse to influence public policy in a healthy way?
Right. Now, I want to go back to the beginning of our conversation, and you're sharing that your work has been inspired by your own visioning and exploration of consciousness states. And you were also talking about the potential of young people's movement. And you're living in California, which is known for, let's say, one of these powerful movements of psychedelic revolution back in the 1970s. Now, in 2020s, we start hearing about the second wave of psychedelic revolution, or the psychedelic renaissance, bringing back what is known as microdosing. I know that you oppose that concept. The use of magical mushroom for psychedelic therapies and many other things. I know this is a controversial subject, especially in Russia, which is like we don't promote any drugs, let's say. So we are discussing a theoretical future concept. So in the future, do you first of all see some kind of psychedelic renaissance happening, and what can be the role of these grassroots explorations of consciousness, including exploration of alternative consciousness states, in kind of awakening of collective consciousness, our ability to overcome these dark tendencies we were talking about? Is there a role for that? You said this was one of your primary interests also.
Well, that was the hope at the beginning in the 1960s and 70s, that if people were able to see the world the way you see it through psychedelic drugs, in which at least temporarily you can see not just the barriers, but the interconnections between people and all life, and the preciousness of life on this particular planet, but the reaction to psychedelic drugs and lumping it in with dangerous drugs like heroin and methamphetamine and cocaine really stopped scientific research. And I think the point is, you're really just arguing from nowhere if you don't do some research on it. And research was criminalized for decades. People couldn't use psychedelics to understand how they worked. Now, what we are seeing is solid scientific research from around the world that shows very positive effects of using MDMA and psilocybin mushrooms with a number of things. Post-traumatic stress syndrome, depression are two of the biggest mental health challenges in the world, that with therapy, this is, you don't just take the drug and magically get better. This has to do with a tool that therapists are now legally allowed to do in California and other parts of the USA. And the other use of it is for end of life. That this research goes back many, many years, and Stanislaus Grof did many thousands of dying patients in Czechoslovakia and then in the United States, that relieving fear and pain for people who are in the process of dying is a proven outcome in many instances, not universally, of administering psilocybin. So I think those are the things that are of the most importance right now, so that we can get some scientific and medical and psychotherapeutic research. But of course, there are people who have always thought that it should be an educational instrument as well. Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Island in, I guess, the 1960s or 1970s, about a scenario in which psychedelics were part of education. you don't have to take psychedelic drugs to experience these effects. Of course, people do it through meditation and fasting and prayer. This is something that every religion has had a mystical core that has to do with practices that alter consciousness. But alteration of consciousness is very dangerous to whoever the ruling class is. So you see things like witch hunts and inquisitions. Thinking differently is very dangerous to those who have a stake in having people think the way they want them to think. So there's very much, it's like what I said about critical thinking. It's very hard for your students to have your students or your children questioning you. Likewise, for political leadership, it's really hard to have an awakened population who are questioning your choices. It's easier to have them a little more docile.
Right. So what's your bet? Like, do you see the potential for massive awakening, or that was like the dream of 1960s and 70s? Is it still there, or do we have to kind of abandon it? Some maybe long-term. We just heard a story from Marilyn Hamilton, who is a scholar of cities, urban development, and she was talking about the 100 years transition into kind of awakened state of society to really create different human settlements and different relationship with the planet. She says this is basically unavoidable. What's your perspective?
Well, some new way of thinking about how this many people live on the planet is inevitable, whether we do it by choice or it's forced on us. A lot of the seeds are out there for more positive outcomes. There's also a lot of possibility for less positive outcomes. Democracies may not be able to deal with the climate crisis. It may be a more authoritarian way of just ensuring the survival of the species. If you take a much longer view and you look back at the evolution of our species, what drove the development of a larger brain in our ancestors may well have been climate crises 1 million years ago. There was a climate crisis about 70,000 years ago, in which maybe only 2,000 or 3,000 humans survived. Maybe they were the ones who learned to speak. It may be that these crises are what drive us to ascend to another level of capability. Whether that's going to be true of the billions of people who inhabit the earth, or whether it's going to be true of the survivors of a catastrophe, I think is up to what people do right now. When I first got online, I used as my email signature, "What it is up to us." And this may be hopelessly optimistic, but I think if you don't think this way, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, we are descended from creatures who thought there must be some way out of this terrible situation. Thinking that does not guarantee that we're going to find the solution. Not thinking that guarantees that we won't.
What a punchline. Thank you, Howard. It's an excellent question. An excellent conversation. I really enjoyed our interview. We have to wrap up. Our simultaneous translator will have to leave us in a moment. So I would like to thank you for this wonderful 1 hour. And I think there's a lot of food for thought for our colleagues who will now process it as we move to our next stage. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Thank you for waking up early. I know you were not very happy about speaking too early. It's 9 a.m. in California, and but thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. So, all right, Howard, we will now switch to the next mode of collaborative work to explore your ideas, and I'll share later with you what we have discovered.
Okay, great, good. Thanks, Pavel. See you.
Okay, bye-bye. Друзья, я передаю, Друзья, я передаю слово Дмитрию Брезицкому, который сейчас сразу переведет вас в режим коллективной работы Спасибо большое за ваше внимание. Я старался зафиксировать еще многие тезисы, но я уверен, что вы свои тоже фиксировали.
Большое спасибо, Павел. Большое количество труда проделано в фиксации, но мы с вами должны сделать ту же самую работу сначала в индивидуальном формате, а потом в групповом формате, когда мы сможем обсудить и выделить самые главные выводы, которые у нас стоят. Итак, в Zoom снова присылаю ссылочку на нашу анкету, которую вам предстоит заполнить. Я видел, что многие уже начали заполнение, и некоторые даже уже отправили. Но чтобы зафиксировать финальные мысли, предлагаю всем буквально минут 5-7 до конца сформулировать и ключевые тезисы, на каких основаниях, на каких главных обоснованиях строит все свои выводы и предложения спикер, собственно, какие утверждения мы верим, какие берем себе в работу, какие понимаем, а какие, собственно, не понимаем, потому что для нас очень важно зафиксировать границу незнания, недопонимания или неверия. Ну и, собственно, те ключевые инсайты, которые к вам пришли. Через 7 минут мы с вами разойдемся вместе по залам, обсудим все это с модераторами, и в 20 часов 40 минут вернемся в общий зал, где я попрошу вас сделать по одному небольшому утверждению от каждой группы, где вы зафиксируете 1, 2 или 3 ключевых значения от каждой группы. И, собственно, в залах мы вместе продолжим работу. Все, итак, 7 минут сейчас на индивидуальное заполнение анкет, ссылочка на которые лежит у вас в чате Zoom.